Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the ContraMinds podcast. And with us today is Connor Joyce. Connor, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us on the show. And we hope to have a lovely conversation with you over the next hour and a half.
Thank you, Vignesh. Pleasure to be on the show.
Right. So, Connor, you're most known for your work and evangelization, if I might use the term, for the adoption and use of behavioral science. So, my first question to you is: so behavioral science is almost like a very it's almost like a umbrella term, so to speak, where you're actually using a lot of different techniques and different skill sets and different knowledge and frameworks from related fields. So just to start things off, could you tell us what are the similarities and differences between behavioral science, UX, and data science?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's so true. It's at a very high level. I've been thinking about this a lot. Is applied behavioral science its own field, or is it actually just a specialization of other fields? And the reason that I think that is, I see more and more firms starting behavioral science teams. At some point, I'll probably talk about my work at Microsoft and at Tonal, where I've been a part of and helped build the first behavioral science teams. But I also see a lot of firms that don't want to go and create a dedicated behavioral science team and instead want to try to help get their PMs and their user researchers and other data scientists, etc., get them equipped with behavioral science skills so they can weave that into their work. And so it is, I think it's the jury's still out, we'll say, on which is more. I think that ultimately there will probably be a place for applied behavioral scientists as a whole. And then there will also be others who just become specialized in it while still maintaining their main department. But if we look at the state of the field as of today, we'll say, and what are the differences between an individual who calls himself an applied behavioral scientist, such as myself, compared to people in user research and data science? I think let's talk about the similarities first. All of them think about user needs and trying to discover patterns of user behavior just at different levels. And I'll talk a little bit more about those levels at the differences. I think that all of the teams are also research teams. They use research principles. I think that it differs depending on the actual company, but all of them pursue some sort of research in how they approach their projects. And that's another similarity that I think is really important to think about, is that all of those teams are auxiliary units. They may help with cost savings, but none of them per se build products, so they don't actually address the bottom line. And instead they pick up projects to help those teams, like your product management, your engineering, your marketing, places, departments like that, that are actually creating a end bottom line value, or actually creating money for the firm. So I think all of them have an important role to play in creating those projects. And then the last similarity on that line is that all of them have to be very good at stakeholder management to ensure that they really do have the right project to impact what is most important for those revenue generating departments. So those are some of the similarities. Like I said, there's many more, but I think those are some of the ones that I see most common. Now, when we look at the differences, and again, this is just my take, it does depend on the company. It depends on the how advanced each of these units are. It depends on a lot of variables. I've seen UX done extraordinarily well. I've also seen UX done where it was really just, hey, let's go survey some people and see what happens. Same thing with data science. I've seen data science being nothing more than just traditional descriptive analytics, all the way to, you see some of these large tech firms that have huge ML models that have the potential to truly change the world, and coming out of data science teams. So I think that I'll condition everything I'm saying with it really does depend on the actual company. But I believe that behavioral science has a great difference in that it focuses on specific user outcomes. And what I mean by that is, if I look at user experience, they are generally looking for user needs. They're looking for the opportunities to understand what the user wants. And again, even with user needs, the things that are missing from that user's life. If I look at data science, they're looking at aggregates. They're looking at the high level overview of what are the patterns of behavior. Could also be patterns of desires or needs, etc. But they are looking at the high level. And I see applied behavioral science as fitting in between that spectrum of low level individual user needs, high level aggregate user needs, but focusing on what are the specific intentions that a user is bringing to whatever product that they're using, and is that product satisfying that need. And again, I will one last time condition. It depends on the group. I have seen UX teams focusing on that. I have seen data science teams focusing on that. But when they are not, applied behavioral science at its core is all about thinking about outcomes, all about what is the specific behavior that has been changed. And so applied behavioral science brings that very unique perspective. The one other piece that I'll say is that user experience generally leans more qualitative. Data science generally leans more quantitative. And I found with applied behavioral science, since it's so outcome driven, that it really depends on the project on which methodology is necessary. And for that, I'll reference that an applied behavioral scientist really has to be a mixed method researcher, bringing in the principles of what is the gold standard of research, which is an RCT. Bring in those elements and utilize those elements across both quantitative and qualitative experiments. The last thing I'll touch on, and you Vignesh, you brought this up in the beginning of the question, but the last main difference that I see of applied behavioral science is that behavioral science is a loosely defined field in the sense that it really is an applied social scientist. There's principles from psychology. I just finished this week. I've been at an economics conference, and I've been surprised how many times I've heard principles that I've heard of in behavioral science applied in economics too. So it truly is. It takes understandings from all of the other social science fields, and I believe that that's a unique characteristic of being an applied behavioral scientist. Is you have to have familiarity with economics, sociology, psychology, a little bit of anthropology. You have to have the surface level understanding of all of those different fields that then you can bring to those user problems.
So if I could just have a quick couple of follow up questions, I would. The first one of which would be, you spoke about mixed method research, right? Mixed methods research. So could you give us a more detailed definition of what you mean by mixed method research for the clarity of our listeners? And secondly, when you look at the way traditional product management is done, you always have a requirements document, and then you have a feature document where you have your user stories and stuff like that, right? So your user stories basically define what needs to be designed. So my second follow up question is in two parts, which is first, uh, how does a user story differ from a user outcome, and how do you tie a user story to a user outcome?
Mm. I may need reminding of that second question once I'm finished with the first. But the briefly on what a mixed method researcher is. It is a individual who is able to use both qualitative, and I'll use the example of user interviews, focus groups, things like that, and quantitative. And quantitative can be using modeling within like a data science machine learning approach. It could also be just running basic statistics on like survey results. So a mixed method researcher is able to identify what is the deliverable that the team is trying to create, what insights have to be within that deliverable, and then what is the best method to actually achieve that. And so I find a lot of researchers begin to specialize in one area, either qualitative and quantitative. And I think that's fair. It's still how research teams generally organize themselves. But a mixed method researcher can still have a focus area, but is also able and ready to go and jump onto the other side if it's necessary and have some skills in doing whatever that type of research is.
So when we look at traditional product management, we always have this concept of a product requirements document and a feature document and user stories and stuff like that, right? So when we even look at the structure of a user story, the structure of the user story is largely defined to is largely written to define the requirements that needs to be given to the developer, right? So that there is accuracy in what's being asked and what's being built. So, in the context of user outcomes, could you just talk to us a little bit about the difference between user stories and user outcomes, and how do you tie user stories to user outcomes to design and deliver useful products that really change customers' lives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as I keep defaulting because I want to make sure that I'm not overgeneralizing. So I'll say it. I've seen both good user stories and I've seen also rather basic ones. So I think that they could be the same thing at times. I think that the user outcomes could be a part of those user journeys. If we think about a user journey just in a basic flow of a user, we'll say we'll take an app, so a user picks up. Actually, I'll use the. I've been using Lyft a lot. I actually really like Lyft. I think that I like their design. I like their flow. I think they have a great data science team. I believe they even have some behavioral scientists, or at least again a data science team that has some specialization in behavioral science. But if when I pick up my app, what am I trying to do ultimately? And that's what that user outcome is. When I have, what intention am I bringing to Lyft? It's generally I need to get somewhere as easy as possible, potentially as cheap as possible. Potentially I need to schedule something. There's different needs and outcomes that I'm looking to have, but we'll use the outcome of I need to get to my destination as easy as possible. Now, if that's the outcome, how will we measure that? We could look at satisfaction scores. Well, first of all, we'll take it. I have kind of a diagram in my head of different levels of outcomes. So the first outcome could be just usage. Did I use Lyft to get from A to B? Okay, so that tells us something. Well, we can dive in a little bit more with that. Now, was I happy with using Lyft? And that would be the next level of outcome. And I generally call that like a customer satisfaction. CSAT is something that many may be familiar with. But does that still actually tell me, did I achieve the outcome of feeling that Lyft made my process of getting from A to B easier? It doesn't. It doesn't. It tells me, yes, I used it, but maybe every other available option wasn't available, or it had some huge wait time because maybe I'm in Chicago right now, maybe a big festival's going on, and Lyft just happened to have the shortest wait time. Is it easy for me to be able to the if we're ultimately asking the outcome of how easy was it for me to use the app and get my intention, getting to the destination done, getting to the destination B, how easy was it? That could be done with surveys. It could ask me after I've used the app, did I actually find it that it was the easiest option for me? Could ask me what were the primary drivers of me deciding to use Lyft. But they could also look at behavioral data. How long does it take for an individual once they open the app to select which ride that they're going to do? How long does it take for that car to get there? And then for that car to drop them off. So there's other metrics that could be included. I think of them if we go down that list. There's usage, there's CSAT or customer satisfaction. There's the direct outcomes. What did I ultimately do, and what were the behaviors that I took after interacting with the app? And then there's those true behavioral outcomes, which is how did it change whatever intentions that I brought to the app? Have I found a new, faster way to get to my destination? And so connecting it back to your original question of how is that different than a user journey or a user story, a user story at its basics and most basic is just what does Connor do when he interacts with the app? It's just what is the flow that he is taking within that app. And that can be really helpful at deciding, will Connor use the app, and potentially even helping decide, will Connor enjoy using the app. But it doesn't always mean that it's going to be satisfying the intention that I'm ultimately bringing to the application. And I hate to beat up on social media. It seems like they generally are the one that always gets chosen. But I think it actually delineates the best example of, if I go onto a social media app with the intention of, I want to feel entertainment, I want to feel good, whatever that might be, and then I wound up spending time on the app watching videos that make me angry or invoke other negative emotions. Did I actually? Yes, I used the app. And maybe if you ask me, I even say I enjoyed using the app. But did I fulfill the initial intention of wanting to have entertainment and social connection? No. Instead, I just filled my time with other uh, emotion evoking we can call it entertainment or evoking content. We'll say. So I think that that's the primary difference, is that a user story is focused on that usage and customer satisfaction, where user outcomes are really thinking about, is it satisfying the problem the user brought.
So, Connor, taking off from what you just explained, uh, uh, does a behavioral scientist start to work earlier than the product team in developing products? Because there are three parts that I see a behavioral scientist needs to do. One is understanding peoples and habits. The second one is designing the elements that enhance the usage. And the third one is deploying and measuring behavior, which you spoke about. But what is critical from what I see, from what you're saying, is that the behavioral scientist really starts far ahead than the product team, because you are really looking at an outcome and a behavior. And a change in behavior is what behavioral science really talks about. So, is that the primary objective and the goal of a behavioral scientist?
I think that's exactly how I view it. Is that a behavioral scientist and really research as a whole should start before the product development cycle and then remain after the product ships. And everything in between, there's still a place for research to play, but I believe that the biggest value comes at the beginning. I'll give an example. When I was at Microsoft, one of the projects that I did was what I called a habit diary study. And I think that that's the best example of what you're talking about there. And so when I was working with the product team to think about what are features for which we could create, and with this specific, I was on a team. Take a quick tangent to provide a little bit of context. I was on a team called Viva Insights, and Viva is a Microsoft product that's focused on helping increase employee engagement and well-being. And so we were looking at what, and then I should say Viva Insights is a product that helps do that through the aggregation of de-identified worker behaviors. So time spent in collaboration, time spent, really time spent in collaboration is the best way to put it. And so within that team, we had the idea of what were different features we could create to increase engagement and well-being. One of the biggest features we created was the focus time auto booking feature. For some people who are familiar with Microsoft Teams, you may know it as My Analytics, or Viva Insights. It was what it was rebranded to recently. But this all being said, we were left with thinking, what are different features that we could create that would help with that mission of engagement and well-being? And there's a couple ways to approach that. One is to just go out and see what features that users are requesting, saying, "Hey, I like this idea. Can you go and build this idea?" Another way is just to get a bunch of smart people in a room and say, "Hey, what do you think we should build? And both of those options have potential to create success. But for something, especially like the problem that Viva Insights has of trying to really change employee behavior in a positive way, you need to go deeper. You need to go earlier than even thinking about the user of your product, and instead think about the worker in the world of work. And what I mean by that is you need to think about, how do people actually approach their work? What are the problems that they may have within that work? And then what are opportunities for which features can be built to connect into whatever problems or habits that they're experiencing, habits that they want to increase, habits that they want to decrease. So I created what I call a habit diary study, and I call it habit because it was focused purely on what are the continuous or reoccurring behaviors that workers are experiencing as they're entering a hybrid environment where they were working both at home and at the office. And then I call it a diary study. Well, I should say it was a diary study because it was multiple interviews across, I believe it was four to 6 weeks. And then the reason I chose that component is, if you ask someone, tell me some behaviors that you've been doing at work that you don't want to do, you ask them once, they're going to tell you what is the freshest on their mind. They're going to say, "Oh, I just spent all day in email and that made me upset. That just happened yesterday." Maybe that's only happened once in the last month or two, but that's what they're choosing because it's present bias, it's front of their mind. So I added the temporal component, and I think the benefit of a diary study is you ask that person the same question over 4 weeks, and you get to start to see a pattern, because over that, with that temporal component, you're reducing present bias, and you get to see what are the actual habits that this person wants to change. And so within this habit diary study, that's what we focused on. We looked at what were the behaviors that an individual was beginning to form in a hybrid work environment that they wanted to change. And those became a great opportunity for us to say that's the areas that we should go and build features, because we knew that as hybrid grew, that we were actually going to be able to have features out there to help people satisfy their needs.
Brilliant. So literally, the habits and getting into the lives of people and actually looking at what their problems are, or what their pain, or what they are looking at, is pretty much far ahead of the need to build a product with features. So it's almost like a pre-feature study, right? Which is
Maximum value
really,
of
I think
behavioral
that's really
science
where the
starts.
starts to add value to a company, right?
Completely. Yeah. Yeah, I would say for in the before section of that's a huge opportunity for applied behavioral science.
So we have a bunch of individuals with expertise and know-how of behavioral science tools and techniques. And let's say that you get all of them into a room and you put them in a free pre-feature setup, or you're getting them to work with the product teams to understand why a product is not working. You're sending them to work with customers to understand what objectives are not being met. So there are many ways to actually deeply implement behavioral science into the layers of the company's operations. So my question is, when you put these people together as a team, you call them, let's say, a behavioral science team. So my question would be, what would be some of the intellectual skills that would be required to be a fine behavioral scientist? And how do they really contribute? How does the behavioral science team really contribute to business impact?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll parse that out into the individual and then the team. I've done a lot more thinking about the individual, but I'm happy to touch on the team there too. So applied behavioral science, we talked about a lot, still very undefined. And I'm trying to help to put some definition to the field. And I started a group called the Applied Behavioral Scientist with a few other leaders in the field of trying to really set out what are some standards around what actually makes this field. I think that some people may have seen the data science Venn diagram, which, if I remember correctly, it has machine learning, programming and statistical capabilities is kind of fits what a data scientist is. I feel like there was a seismic shift once it actually was like, oh, there's a way to define this thing that everybody is so excited about, and I'm hoping we can do the same thing. And in the interim, I've created my own Venn diagram for applied behavioral science. And I think the three pieces are mixed methods research. We talked about that. I'll touch on it again. Uh, Domain expertise, at the expertise, which is understanding the behavioral science principles and understanding how the various concepts and how they come together. I'll touch on that a little bit more. It also, I believe, includes having at least one industry expertise. And again, I can touch on that a little bit more, but I think that it's because behavioral science is very domain specific. Health behavioral science has its own intricacies, just as labor behavioral science does. And the last piece is communication. And I'll start there with saying communication is such an important piece for any researcher, but it's especially important for an applied behavioral science researcher because, as I said, I do see it in many ways as being this applied social scientist. And I have seen so many academic articles passed around businesses that people may just read the abstract, if anything, and that's it. And it's because there is the average person doesn't have the time or the desire to dive into the deep jargon that's needed to be able to understand the average social science journal article. So the role of the applied behavioral scientist is to read that paper and then distill the most actionable insights. I truly believe that you lose people when you can't distill a set of insights into one PowerPoint slide. I think and maybe I started my career in consulting, and so maybe that's a little bit of a bias, all about the slide presentations. But that is my focus. Is I need to get at least one, if not two or three insights onto that one slide, and if I can't do that, I doubt that people are going to really care that much, or even more. Maybe they'll care, but I doubt it will actually be actionable. So communications, one of those pieces of the Venn diagram. As I said, mixed methods is the next, and we already kind of described what mixed methods is, but the piece that I'll hit on significantly is that the applied behavioral scientist has to be able to choose what is the best way to approach a research project, and then even more so has to be able to make the trade-offs that are required of doing research in an applied setting. And I think that or I should say, what I see commonly happen is academics that they'll go and get a PhD, maybe do a postdoc, and then they'll come to a company and be like, how do I get any research done? I have too tight timelines. I have the inability to actually control the environment. And it's because the realities is I have never seen a full scale RCT be done by in-house researchers. I've seen it as collaborations between professors and in-house researchers, but the average in-house researcher doesn't have the resources to do an academic level research project. And that's just the reality of it. It's because companies are not intended to create perfect level new knowledge. They're intended to make money. And so for that reason, I should say, yeah, an applied behavioral scientist or a mixed method researcher has to be able to make those trade offs and say, okay, I have 6 months to get this done. Well, I'm going to have to throw out some of the things that are the gold standards of RCTs right away. And now with those 6 months, I have to make the trade-offs that maybe I'll be able to control these variables, or I'll be able to collect this sample. Maybe with 6 months I can do a random sample, but I'm still going to have sampling bias here or there. And there's a lot of these trade-offs. So the more that an individual, it comes with experience and with education to just be able to understand what is the best that I can do with the constraints that I have. And I'll touch just briefly on the ethics piece of this because that's a question that comes up a lot. Is will they say, well, If you're doing that, then you're creating bad information. And I think we could have a scientific debate all day on creating evidence and creating research. But my rule of thumb, my ethical guideline is, if I'm creating knowledge that is better than nothing, then I feel I'm doing all right. And so I want to make sure I don't create knowledge that's actually pointing in the wrong direction. And if I think a research study is going to do that, that's when I will really put the brakes on it and say we can't do this. But as long as the evidence that's being created is going to help the decision maker better than if they had nothing and were just running on intuition, then I'm comfortable pushing forward with that. So we talked about communication, we've talked about mixed method research, and the last piece is of the actual domain expertise. And for domain expertise, I see four main components of behavioral science. I posted this on LinkedIn and I had so many different opinions come. And so this is just Connor Joyce's take, but I believe that applied behavioral science includes choice architecture, which, if you've ever heard the book Nudge, that's all about choice architecture. Libertarian paternalism, nudges, choice architecture are all in the same wheelhouse. There's biases and heuristics, which that's going to be the Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman's work. It's encapsulated in the book Thinking Fast and Slow. If you've ever seen those big diagrams with a bunch of different biases and stuff like that, you don't need to know, as an applied behavioral scientist, you don't need to. I've never been quizzed where someone's just like, hey, what's present bias, or what's choice overload? But you should have familiarity with those biases so that you know how to apply them when you're thinking about creating messages or different interventions, etc. The next one is habit formation, and there's been some great books that have been written on. You have like James Clear and the Habit Loop. You have Nir and the Hooked Habit Model. There's a lot of different takes on habit formation, but one should understand the basics of how do habits form and how do habits break. And then the last piece that I think is really important is social norms, and that's the newest of them all. But it's also the most fast growing, because as a field in this domain, people are recognizing that you have to focus on not only the individual but the context and the environment that they're in, and social norms does a great job with that. So to wrap up the individual, I think an applied behavioral scientist again is a good communicator, a mixed methods researcher, and then has domain expertise. So a team is going to have those three capabilities. And it is, sometimes you will have an individual who can do all three of those. It is rare. There are few people. I mean, humbly, I consider myself one of them, and it's because of the kind of odd career path that I had, where I started in consulting, and that was where I learned how to really become a good communicator with taking advanced insights and distilling them into turning them into slides ultimately. I did a master's, and that's where I got the domain expertise, and I've read a lot of books, attended courses, really kept up with the applied behavioral science field. And then research has just come with the actual researcher roles that I've taken. So I believe there are definitely people out there. Anytime that you see an individual applied behavioral scientist running their own team, they are likely kind of a unicorn where they have all three of those skills. But until the field has a lot of master's programs, right now there's only like three or four, until the field has a solid pipeline, something that I'm trying to build with the Applied Behavioral Science Association, but that is still years away. I think it's unfair to assume that there's a giant talent pool of people that have all three skills. And so when thinking about a team, I see the team as having to comprise a group of people who, you may have a specialized mixed method researcher. You may have someone who is an applied behavioral science PhD that has a deep domain knowledge and very advanced knowledge of the field and can keep up with it. And then you may have a great business analyst or someone who can distill all the insights from that group into simple insights. So when looking at applied behavioral science teams, I think it's more of just taking what I just described for the individual and making sure all three have it. The last piece, and I'm going to be writing about this soon. I'm excited to share more about this because I want to define a maturity curve for behavioral science teams. Is I think that the more parts of that as applied behavioral science team grows, it goes from just sharing behavioral science to actually applying behavioral science. And once you hit that, you may want to pull on designers, you may want to pull on program managers and other people like that onto a behavioral science team to actually help take those insights and get them into whatever product is being built. The next stage is experimenting with those insights, experimenting with whatever interventions are developed. And again, as a team, if the company doesn't already have it, that team should be thinking about how do we build up our experimentation capabilities? How do we build up our A B testing capabilities? You may want to pull on people who aren't just researchers, but who actually understand how to get these large scale tests done at scale, which really is it's difficult much more difficult to deploy a research study that has 100,000 people compared to one that has 100. And then the last piece is personalization, and that's where I kind of see the future of behavioral science going. And at that point, you need to have everything I listed out either in that team or close collaborators with that team, because it really takes a cross departmental approach to be able to collect all of your data and then target interventions separately. So at a basic, I see a team having to comprise of those three pieces, but then as it scales and as it desires to make more impact, it will have to pull on
So,
different resources
so
too.
Connor, one of the observations from whatever you are saying just now, uh, it looks like uh, a data scientist probably needs to know a bit of behavioral science, right? Behavioral science, scientist needs to know a bit of data science, and the designer needs to know a bit of behavioral science, because when you start collaborating, the I would call it the knowledge flow to and fro between these professions become very critical. And would you think that's important for the success of getting the outcome of the behavior that we intend to achieve?
To make sure I got your question correct, there is just that you're asking, is it important for these different groups to have some behavioral science
Yeah,
knowledge?
correct.
Yeah, so 100%. And this is where, and I could talk about this all day, and I don't want to get too theoretical, but I really don't know if applied behavioral science is really better to be just a specialization of those different groups. So if we look at the Venn diagram I just described, that domain expertise piece could just be sprinkled across all of the other. You could have a mixed method researcher that you just sprinkle on some domain expertise. You could have a business analyst or another individual whose goal is just to create the sharing of information, have them have some behavioral science expertise. And again, like you said, with designers and things of that sort. So I 100% agree. I think that there is definitely there's definitely potential for success of not having a single person that can do all those things and instead just empowering a team to do it. um I believe only time really is going to tell if which is the better model, because I still see the argument that you'd need at least one individual to kind of a who's going to teach those people the specialization, and so you may need someone to teach that. And then B, you may still need an individual to kind of choreograph and make sure that there are parameters that are set up around how do we approach our mixed methods research? What are some of the best ways of answering these behavioral related questions? So I don't have a solid answer. It's something I'm constantly thinking about. But I do agree with the premise of your question as a whole, that I think that it will only improve the quality of products, especially products that intend to create behavioral outcomes, which most do, when people are empowered with this information, even if their primary business title isn't behavioral X.
Yeah. So which brings me to the follow-up question, Connor, which is, if you look at some of the market leaders, uh, literally they've been disrupted by a small startup, which probably takes away a big business because they have not seen the behavioral change that is happening with consumers. So, for example, let's take the watch industry, right? And suddenly you got the smartwatch coming in, and the big players uh, have got disrupted because they never saw the smartwatch change coming in, while consumers were wanting to have that kind of a product. So therefore, for large legacy corporations, how can a behavioral science or a department build this scaffolding, if I were to call it, okay, to ensure that they are at a step ahead in actually looking at the changes that are happening in habits. As you rightly said, you did a habit study. How do they start preparing themselves to, so that they can reduce these kinds of disruptions?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that it's so true. I mean, we've seen this disruption, and I've seen some great disruptors who are behaviorally inspired too. I think Lemonade is an insurance company, at least here in America. I believe that they may operate outside of America too, but it's Dan Ariely played a role in it. There was a few other applied behavioral scientists who played a role in it, and they've blown up as an insurance company. I mean, they've gotten much more popular, and it's because they took a behavioral approach to insurance, and thought about how can they use the various more behavioral economics principles of how we evaluate costs and benefits, but utilize those and bring them to the insurance field. And so I totally agree that there is a lot of disruption happening just by new companies thinking about how to more properly solve these behavioral problems. This said, I've also seen some companies start to build behavioral science teams. I have a friend who's going to be starting. I should say at this point he's already started at Cars.com, and they're a more historic company that is building out a behavioral science and experimentation team. And I think that's great for them because companies like Tesla that are coming in with their own direct to consumer model, much more focused on building a great experience, helping ensure people actually achieve whatever intentions they're trying to bring to that car buying experience. And so this company is building an experimentation team, and I would say that is the best approach. Even outside, I think again here behavioral science is auxiliary to the main piece. The main piece is experimentation, I would say, is really as a legacy company. If you're not building out ways to test with your users to see how you can better their experience, you're going to get disrupted. At this point, it's I think it's inevitable because who is going to? I think the classic example I used with Lyft too. Lyft and Uber just totally disrupted the cab market because it there was this experience that most people didn't really enjoy, having to find a cab. You get in, it might not be the best experience. You have a bad instance, there's no one to call, or there's no reconcile, there's no good customer service. And so companies come in and they say, we're going to make this really simple. You call it on your phone. You have customer service there. They've constantly enhanced their safety features, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, but how did those companies get there? Uber and Lyft have some of the most built out experimentation teams. And so, again, as a legacy company thinking about this, as much as it is going back to, if you can do things like these habit diary studies or other sort of work where you're really getting a chance to investigate what are the problems, what are the habits that are forming or the habits that people want to break in your industry, and you're getting ahead of those by building new products and services and features that can address those. I think that's going to help prevent disruption, because if you're not doing it, someone else is going to be doing it, and they're going to be finding those problems, they're going to be solving for them, and then people will gravitate towards those. So I believe at the end of the day, experimentation is what is necessary, and then sprinkling in behavioral science, thinking about how biases and heuristics lead to those problems and those habits, thinking about how the choice environment that someone's faced with is going to lead them to make certain choices. I could go down the road how social norms in that context are pushing someone to decide to choose something that may not be in their best interest, where you could help alleviate those social norms and have them choose the whatever is best for their personal context. All of those sort of things could be thought about within experimentation, but to even do that in the first place, you need to be able to experiment. So if I could provide any advice to any legacy company thinking about trying to prevent disruption, it is establish some sort of experimentation wing, and just start trying to figure out what types of problems you could be solving for your users or your customers.
So just dovetailing from that point you made, where you're talking about different skill sets and sort of really understanding what is the business requirement, what is the strategy that you're leveraging, and how do you bring design and development together, and then how do you test it out and iterate again and again and again, and then having the entire behavioral science tools and techniques layered into the process. Uh, as a follow-up question, I would ask, it's almost like a tangential question, but I would ask, what might Connor Joyce's behavioral science 101 curriculum look like? Because if you're talking about applying these things into the industry, we got to have some context on how to do it in the first place. So, how do you do it? You got to understand certain key tools and some key concepts. So, that's why, what would Connor Joyce's 101 behavioral science or behavioral science 101 look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I spend a decent amount of my time more thinking about, we'll say, like a 201 of specifically focused on trying to get interventions to be more personalized. But I've deployed a couple of these sort of one-on-ones both at Microsoft and now at the company I'm at, Tonal, with my colleagues, trying to just disseminate behavioral science knowledge. And so that was where I got this idea of the four main pillars of behavioral science. Again, choice architecture, biases, heuristics, habit formation, and social norms. I think that those four are the necessary entry to consider yourself an a domain. I don't even, we won't say expert. We'll say a domain understanding, and then getting deeper knowledge in that is when one becomes more of a domain expert. So I think that those are going to be essential. I think that there's also some great frameworks out there that I can't take credit for, but that greater minds have created. Like there's a behavioral insights team has I'm blanking on it right now, but I'll actually give one that I can speak a little bit. Well, first of all, I'd say that a lot of the work that Behavior Insights team creates is great. They've got a lot of good content for introductory. Same with a company called Ideas 42. They have a lot of tools and workbooks. They're a nonprofit, so they have a lot of great free resources. They're one of the partners with the Applied Behavioral Science Association too, so I can only say good things about them. But this being said, of actual frameworks that are really really helpful, I think that there's a book called Designing for Behavioral Change by a gentleman named Steve Wendell. Steve created the behavioral science team at Morningstar. He's no longer there, but he created this, what I look at as the gold standard of a behavioral science team. And I think that it's only, even though he's left, it's only proven to be true, because what I've found is a lot of the behavioral science teams that exist, they actually generally stop existing once the leader leaves. And I've seen that with a few companies at this point. And Steve's is still going strong, even though he left. And the same thing with at Allstate. They also have Allstate's an insurance company too. They have a behavioral science team by a gentleman named Florent. And even though Florent has left, that team is still going. And I think that that's a great example of teams that they're doing enough good work that they remain. The company wants to make sure that they remain even when the manager leaves. But anyway, to address your question, Steve wrote a book designing for behavioral change, and he has a framework in it called Define, which I can't remember each step of it, but it starts with it's all about defining the problem and creating an intervention to solve for that. And so, at an aggregate, on top of having domain expertise, I think that teams need to that any company that's trying to do this sort of work needs to either go and find that defined model or a model similar to be able to start with identifying an area of interest. We want in the problem statement could look something like, we want our users to be doing this because it leads them to this positive outcome. Or to be even more specific, we want users to be doing this specific behavior, which we can measure because we know it leads to this specific user outcome that we know users want. It's those intentions that they're bringing to the product. And even better when you can say we it leads to that this user outcome that we know when it's satisfied, people buy our product more or they continue to use it. So again, the specific measurable behavior connects to the user outcome, which then connects to a business outcome. If you can identify one of those and you're like, okay, we want users to do more of this specific behavior, then you can go and consult a framework like that defined framework, or the many others that are out there that exist, to say, how do we define this context? How do we figure out the best way that we can deploy an intervention? An intervention can be a nudge all the way through a policy or something, but to have that individual begin to exhibit that behavior, which again in turn is going to lead to more sales or increased retention, etc. So it's the domain expertise mixed with the ability to deploy interventions.
So, Connor, if I were to request you to apply your, uh, behavioral science lens and look at the failure of, say, Google Glass as a product, okay? What do you think could have been done better there, or what are the blind spots that probably could have been missed? Because obviously there must have been some user studies, some habits, and it's a very interesting experiment. And there's always a lot of talk about successful experiments, but if I were to take experiment that did not work well, or it could be even Google Plus, right? So where I think these experiments, like a Google Glass, where they tried doing these things, where do you think, if you apply the behavioral science lens, what could have been done better, and how do you think we could avoid some of these mistakes?
Yeah, I- I'll parse it into two pieces. I think there's a big social norms piece, and we'll talk about that one. And I think that there's been some good focus on that. There's also the intentions piece, and I'd like to talk about that. I'll start with the social norms, which is, first of all, we whenever it's one thing to have a phone in your pocket and to have that away from the world, we'll say, and then you pull it out when you need to. It's another to take and I'm wearing glasses and I'm holding my glasses right now, because it's another thing to say, I'm going to take this technology and put it on my head, and I'm going to begin to use this technology in a way that everyone can see on a daily basis. And I think that that is actually one of the biggest things that stopped Google Glasses. And I'm really excited to see how Meta approaches this, because Meta has all these ambitions to create AR glasses. And Snap, actually, they did their Snap spectacles, which I think they did a good job. Snap does a good job overall connecting with the hip crowd and kind of making sure that whatever they're building connects into influencers, connects into the we'll say the high status culture of or popular culture. Yeah, I guess just popular culture. Google didn't really do an attempt at that. They kind of did. I actually applied for this. It's funny you used the Google Glass. I applied for that. I was in college. I was in my undergrad when they first released it, and they said, we're going to do this program where if you can go out and become a brand ambassador for Google Glass, you can go out and you can talk about how much you love it. You can show it off to everyone. We'll send you and you can be one of the first early adopters of it. And I applied for it because I was like, oh, I'm on campus. I was student body president at the time, and I was like, I'll wear them to all of the meetings so all the students see what Google Glass does. So they tried. Who knows why that program didn't take off? It may have truly just been a little too early for its time. But the social norms are very, very important in something that is so publicly visible. If it is not a norm to wear technology on your face, it is going to not be desirable, because people are going to feel weird doing it. And social norms again play such a big role. It's social norms are why it's appropriate to use an umbrella when it rains in most cities, but it's kind of weird to do it in Seattle, where I'm based at, because it rains so much in Seattle. People just wear rain jackets, it's uncommon to see people wearing umbrellas. So it's funny how social norms really do dictate what is common and uncommon, and to wear technology on your face is just it's uncommon at this point. So any company that approaches a product like that is going to have to first address that social norm and then build a great product. And yeah, I'll give the other example of, I wear a ring it's called the Aura ring. Big fan of it. It does sleep tracking, and I think that it does. This is a great example. You can look up Aura, assume it's aura.com, Oura, and it's a very sleek ring that does a very practical thing. It's something I wear every day, even though I only use it for my sleep tracking, but it's because it's a stylish ring. And no one knows unless I pull it off and I show them that it has little sensors in it. No one knows it's a sleep ring. They just think, oh, that's just a cool onyx ring that guy's wearing. And so if either they can address the social norms of wearing the technology, if it's going to have a big camera on it, or if it's going to be thick and bulky like I believe the Google glasses were, they're going to need to address that social norm, or they're going to have to make it so sleek that you don't even know that it is a wearable technology similar to what the Aura ring has. So that's piece number one. The second piece that I'll just touch on is kind of that intentions. Is when it came out, to my knowledge, it was more hard to use than a smartphone. And if we think again about what are the intentions that most people bring to their smartphone usage, it's other than the rare cases of exploring behaviors or other maybe tools that people are using on their cell phone, they are using their cell phone as a means to an end. I am using my cell phone to contact my wife to tell her that I'm going to pick up dinner tonight. Or I am using my cell phone to email my colleague to let them know that the project will be done at 5 p.m. today. The cell phone is a means to an end, and when you're looking at, that's the intention that I'm bringing to whatever apps that I'm using. If I look at, why am I not using the glasses, which I need to use a little doggle that's up by my ear, and I'm looking to my upper right to try to find the app that I'm looking for, whatever it might be. No wonder people just kept using their cell phones, because it's a familiar interface that's faster, and it's helping actually satisfy that intention that I'm bringing to device much better than the pair of glasses are. So in summary, they need to break the social norms, and then they need to make it easier to use than a cell phone.
And when you contrast that with, say, a smartwatch, right? So the Apple Watch, there's no social norm really, because you just used the watch for, looking at the time, or things like that. So where do you think the social norm of a smartwatch or an Apple Watch, was something that people, because you never saw anybody wearing a watch tracking, all the behavior and their fitness and things like that, was not a norm. So where do you think, applying the same lens that the social norm lens, where do you think there was a tipping point for it to actually get adopted so much?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's what Apple does really well too, and so that's why I am, as much as I'm excited to see whatever Meta creates, I'm even more excited to see what Apple creates once they create some sort of AR glasses, because they are great at it. So again, I remember back in my undergrad, we had a hackathon, and the first prize for the hackathon, or maybe it was one of the prizes for the hackathon, was a set of Pebble watches. And I remember going, what is this Pebble watch? And then finding that it was a very simple, I think it was just black and white screen, maybe it was color, but it was a very, very simple wristwatch that was the original smartwatches. And I was like, wow, this is a interesting concept. I'll never forget one of the people who won the hackathon. They took one of those Pebble smartwatches and they imported I think it was Chipotle. Chipotle was one of the first companies to make like a online ordering app, and they somehow were able to re-engineer the Chipotle Android app into this Pebble smartwatch. And I remember they won the hackathon because it was pretty cool. You could order a burrito off your smartwatch, and it was such a novel idea, right? At that point, I mean, I assume that Chipotle allows you to do that with an Apple Watch app, but to do that with a Pebble like 8 years ago was pretty fascinating. And I I I think again, ultimately, Apple was the one who really helped that tipping point. I'm trying to kind of go through and think if there was any other smart devices, because I mean it's just now the Pixel Watch came out, right? And it's been, how many years have Android fans been asking for a Pixel Watch? Because even when Google Watch OS opened up and you had companies like Skagen, if I'm saying them correctly, they're a nicer watch company that creates an Android watch. There's a couple of others. I think Fossil also did a few, but you've had these companies that are trying, brand names, ones that you used to go, oh wow, you're wearing that brand watch, them create with smartwatches, and it never took off. Whereas as you had the Apple Watch just really, really take off. And so again, I'm just speculating, and this is a great question. I'm writing a Apple Watch case study right now because I love their fitness piece, and so I'll touch on that. I don't think it fully addresses your question, and I'll admit I just actually switched over to iOS a year ago, so I'm still getting familiar with the whole Apple ecosystem and the joys of having an Apple Watch. But I think that they made it sleek enough and had the accessories that allows an individual to wear a really nice watch band with their smartwatch, making it so it doesn't look that different than a regular watch. And I think that plays a big role. I also think so. Well, actually, I'll use the Google glasses. So again, when we said with glasses, what was the social norm was it was weird because it was this big bulky pair of glasses. The watch doesn't look that different than a regular watch. I think that's, and then the other piece was that the Google glasses weren't that practical. That it was still easier to do it on your smartphone. It's actually easier to get things done on the watch at times than it is on a smartphone, and so they've made it very practical. They've made it very functional, we'll say. Um, and so I think those are two big contributing factors. The other piece is that, and this is more of a secondary effect, but I think is why it only continues to grow. and that there's so much more potential with Apple Watch still, is the three rings within the activity tracker. I think is one of the best design elements I've ever encountered. It takes complex information, calories burned, minutes doing vigorous activity, and hours that I've stood for at least 1 minute, and it condenses it into a very easy to understand ring. And which also, a ring is a great thing because it relies on the principle of closure, which is something that's innate to humans. We like closure. And so now you're taking these elements of an intention that I have, of me wanting to work out more, and you're distilling it into a design element that encourages me to follow through with those intentions, because as a human I say I want to close these rings, I want to do whatever is necessary to ultimately close those rings. And then you take it even more, and what can I do? I can share my rings with my friends. So now my friends know when I'm closing my rings. A buddy of mine had an arms race for a little while where we each raise our calories for how many calories we would burn in a day by 10. So he raised it 10, I raised it 10, he raised it 10, to the point now that I think mine is almost, it's 1060 calories. So we went back and forth, and now, but what did it do? That race now made it so I push myself pretty hard now to ensure that I close those rings every day, and it's helping me maintain my weight, which again was the intention of why I ever wanted to engage with a fitness tracker in the first place. So bringing it back home, I would say that, from my view, that the watch has taken off thanks to Apple, of their good design, mixed with making it a very functional device for the intentions that people bring to why they want to wear a fitness tracker like that.
I think it's great that you even touched upon the Apple Watch as an example, because I think the two key elements to what makes a product like the Apple Watch successful are the concepts of choice and behavior. People choose to be healthy, people choose to be fit, people choose to wake up on time. So when they make that choice, the choice has to be backed by a behavior. So it's almost like they're allowing people to choose the behaviors that they want, and they're giving them the nudges on how do they get to that behavior or that desired state. So speaking of nudges, can you talk a little bit about how the theory of nudges or how choice architecture actually came into play, and why is it such a core cornerstone sort of a framework or a idea that is at the heart of behavior science?
Yeah, Vignesh, you said it so well too. I love that. Is that it is choice is such an important thing. We as humans love autonomy and agency, and so giving us the opportunity to choose something but then help me follow through with it is huge. And that really does, it's a great introduction to the principle of nudge. So nudge is this book, it's, or I should say, it's been around for a while, but the actual nudge of our current age started with a book that came out in the early 2000s with a gentleman named Richard Thaler and another gentleman named Cass Sunstein, and they're the grandfathers of nudge. And their philosophy was paternalistic, or libertarian paternalism. And so libertarians are people who believe in small government, free agency, let people be themselves. Here in America, we've got it's actually really big libertarian kind of underpinning if you look at the history of the country. And then paternalism is the belief that a government or a larger body should give you instructions on how to act. Paternalism, you have parent in the name. It's what parents generally do, is they give you structure, they sometimes force you to choose the best option, etc. So those two words come together, and you're like, well, they're, don't they contradict themselves? And they do, to a degree, but when you put them together and you give a spin, then it ultimately becomes nudge. And it's saying, give people the option to choose whatever option they want, but focus and create the choice environment, or as they call the choice architecture, so that one decision is easier, more highlighted, more accessible, more obvious, more etc. than all the other options. And that's the paternalism part. So libertarian is being able to choose any option. Paternalism is choosing what is the choice architect choosing one option to focus on and encourage people to choose. And so the theory of nudge at its core is just any different tweaking of the choice environment to focus on one option over all of the others. The classic example of this that was in Nudge was the use of defaults in organ donations. So if you ask the average person, do you want to be an organ donor? It helps save people's lives. The average person's probably going to say, "Yeah, I think I want to do that." And they did surveys that showed the average person is interested in being an organ donor. But when you look at the rates of organ donation, people who have said I will be an organ donor, it was significantly lower. And so they investigated, well, why is that? And they found, well, when do you indicate that you are going to be an organ donor? Here in America, it's when you go to the DMV. And in a lot of other countries, it's when you're going to get your motor's license. And the DMV, especially here in the States, is known as a place you want to get out of as quickly as possible. You just want to do your thing and you want to get out of there. And so any additional friction or any additional barrier that you're going to face at the DMV, you're not going to give your full conscious effort to. You are going to do whatever is possible to get it over with as quick as possible. And so the organ donation, they ultimately took the default of, if I'm getting my license, it'll ask me a question: Connor, would you like to be an organ donor? And most people, the default there is no, because you're asking me a question that I have to provide additional effort to ultimately agree with. And so I just say no and move on because I'm trying to get out of the DMV. And so the simple nudge that they did to tweak that environment was to change the default to yes by asking the question instead: Connor, do you want to opt out of being an organ donor? And by saying that opt out rather than an opt in, they saw the rates of organ donation skyrocket. I can't remember the specific numbers, but we're talking it went from 10-20% to 80-90%. And so that is the canonical example of a nudge, of a simple reframing of a step in a process that yielded significant behavior change. I'll give one other brief example, the one that I love. And it's funny, my wife now works at Google, and so I've been asking her questions about their cafeteria. But their Laszlo Bach was the Google's chief people officer for a while. And in his book, I think it was called Work Rules, he talks about this classic example that's been written about a fair amount now, which is at the Google campus, they wanted to encourage people to eat less calories. And everybody knows now that Google's known for their like great food in their offices. But what does free food mean? It means that there's generally increased consumption because you're like, I'm hungry. Well, there's no cost, so I'll go and grab a handful of M&Ms, a Twix bar, I'll grab a cookie over here, maybe I'll grab some chips. But they wanted to reduce the calorie intake while still giving the full spread of options to individuals. And so what they ultimately did was they put healthier options at eye level and within simple reach of any individual that came into the kitchen, where they took the M&Ms and M's and the more unhealthy options and either put them behind cabinets or above eye level so that people would know it would not be the first option that came to mind. And they found that simple reorganization of the choice environment led people to eat less calories. And so, again, libertarian paternalism, they gave all options were available, but they reorganized it in a paternalistic way that encouraged people to eat less calories. And so what are nudges ultimately? They are those changes to the choice environment, and we see them all over the place now. We see them in the notifications that we give. I just released an A/B test at the company Tonal that I'm working at, where we were using different nudges. We were using these different behavioral principles. One, loss aversion, utilizing the fact that people are more likely to take action to prevent losses than they are to achieve gains. We used social norms, the fact or social proofs, I should say, which is utilizing the fact that if you tell someone, hey, a lot of your friends are taking this activity, they're more likely to take that activity. We use different behavioral principles like this in push notifications that we did, reminding people to work out. And so those are nudges that are able to be leveraged where they're actually bringing a new piece of information to an individual's choice environment, reminding them of an opportunity to go and follow through with their intentions, which in this case was working out. And so we see nudges being leveraged again across a lot of the different technology that we use nowadays. And yeah, and the one last piece, and I was trying to think of the best way to weave this in, but I'll just go ahead and say it, is that the one piece that I want to condition or that I want to qualify this discussion with nudges with is that the defaults example with organ donation, huge change, super simple. Another classic example is with choice overload and 401ks, where Vanguard was able to increase the amount of people subscribing to their 401ks by actually reducing the amount of choices of different investment opportunities. The Google example that I gave, those are all very classic, very easy nudges that led to substantial changes in behavior. The reality that we are beginning to see, and that again, I believe the future of behavioral science is personalization, is that most choices are not that easy, unfortunately. If only it was, these nudges could have that big of an impact. Instead, is what we're realizing is that there are generally different types of users. It doesn't have to be personalized down to the individual, but down to the archetype or group, we'll say cluster of users, that different clusters of users respond to different messages better. And I believe that that is actually the future of nudge, is that we'll have 10 different options and 6 different clusters, and we'll know cluster 1 responds to option A and option C the best. Cluster 2 responds to option B and option E the best down the list. And that is again kind of putting a bow to this whole conversation, is why experimentation is really needed, why having lots of different domain knowledge and being able to try out different types of tests, is all of that is so important, or I should say different types of behavioral concepts. All of that is so important to know ultimately what types of users are going to respond to which types of nudges or which types of interventions the best.
Great. So, Connor, I just want to ask uh, my last question, which is really how important is the cultural aspects uh, of different geographies and different countries important in interventions that you're talking about? How critical is it, and how do behavioral scientists work on that? Because I wouldn't know the cultural aspects of, say, the US. You wouldn't probably know as much about the South Asian culture. So, how important is culture as a key ingredient in these interventions?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge, and it's an area that I'll be honest, I don't know as much about. There are many others that have much greater knowledge on the different aspects of culture. The one that I've just experienced the most firsthand from my travels is the difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures, and that alone, there are some significant differences that I actually wrote about one, and so I'll give this quick anecdote that I thought was really interesting. So in weight loss, in individualistic countries, we talk a lot about us. It's weight loss is about you. It's about you want to tell your friends. You want to show that you as an individual have agency over your life. You want to show that you are able to achieve your goals because you're powerful. You. But I was talking with my friend when I was in India about her weight loss journey, and being in a collectivistic culture. She was talking about how for her, when she tells people she's losing weight, that it's embarrassing, and that there's a lot of stigma that's associated with it, because it's almost like, why are the people around you allowing you to be unhealthy? You recognize you're unhealthy, and that your community, your family, they're allowing you to keep eating, they're allowing you to become this way. And so she's on a weight loss journey right now, but she has to keep it very private because she doesn't want anyone to call her out, or even worse, call her family out for. And I should say she's a little bit of a younger person too, so her family, the types of food and things like that do play a role in her choices. And so we're in the individualistic culture, I don't see that playing out as much. In that, I found it fascinating in the collectivistic culture. It makes sense since the family unit has such an important place in the community, whereas the individual is just so much bigger in a place in like a Western culture like America. So just that one dimension, just individualistic versus culture or versus collectivistic, is playing a huge role in how I, as a behavioral scientist at a company that's trying to help people achieve their fitness goals, has to think about how I would communicate to that, because a lot of the interventions that I'm thinking about deploying involve building community, involve helping connect people to others, sharing their journey, sharing their message, sharing their progress. But all of those will probably not be that useful to someone in a collectivistic culture. So there, I believe it's Hofstadter. I've been trying to think of who created these original cultural differences. I believe that yeah, hopefully that's right. If not, if you look up individualistic or collectivistic.
It's the Hofstede model.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that confirmation. I've been racking my brain while I'm talking here, going. I know I read all of there's that's just one dimension of many dimensions. So yes, like I said, when I was at Microsoft, had a much more much obviously Microsoft's in a lot of countries, so I got to think about some of these things. I didn't have as much opportunity to test on them. I'm doing a lot more testing in my current job at Tonal, but right now Tonal is a startup that's only in America, and so I don't have to think about these larger cultural characteristics as much. As we expand, I'm excited to start to broach these subjects with weight loss also, I should say, weight loss and other fitness journeys. But yeah, but at an aggregate, cultural differences play a really big role. And the last piece I'll say on it is that there's this new philosophy of weird psychology, and weird stands for Western educated industrial. I can't remember what the R is.
Rich and democratic.
uh, yes, rich and democratic. Yes, thank you. So does, and it's so true that so much of our understanding of psychology was done on college students that match all of those characteristics that we just talked about. So even the science for which an individual like me bases my assumptions may have some cultural bias in it. And if that's the case, we got a lot of work to do to really understand what is the best way to nudge a female in India who's on a weight loss journey. I mean, it is a it's there's a lot to work to do in the cultural aspect.
Thanks, Connor. And a couple of our last, rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
What does success mean to you?
Success ultimately means to me of contributing to this field and contributing to helping people actually achieve the outcomes that they bring to products. I read once about the triple win of behavioral science, that's helping people achieve their user outcomes, it's helping the business be able to continue increasing retention and selling products through achieving those outcomes. And then it makes the world a better place because people are achieving their outcomes. And so for me, if I'm doing work that's helping with that triple win, it's success to me, on top of enjoying the journey.
My follow-up question, Connor, is what are some of the books that have influenced you the most over the course of your life and career?
Yeah, definitely. The book that kickstarted this whole journey for me was Misbehaving, which is also by Richard Thaler. It's not as known as Nudge, but it talks about Thaler's journey being an economist, asking all of these behavioral questions and thinking, why are people not investigating some of these more in depth, and creating his career around that. And I to a degree had a similar journey with being in consulting, uh, doing management consulting, where we were doing these large scale change programs, seeing some of the flaws in the approaches and saying, why are we not doing more of this behavioral science work? And so I just, it really connected with me. And then the other one is Thinking Fast and Slow, which is the really the one of the most in-depth behavioral science books that's out there. Just because it left me with realizing there's so many more questions that I had and so many more opportunities to explore, and it ultimately led me to say, well, I got to go and get a master's in this because there's so much more for me to learn in this field.
So, what would be the uh, one piece of advice that you would give to an 18-year-old who is in an university today,
And any studying anything or studying behavioral science?
studying anything? What would you think is important for an 18-year-old studying in an university?
I think that the biggest thing that I've realized over my life, and it was probably the best advice that I was given in college that I've really seen is true, is it's important to follow it's important to follow what interests you in your career, because the reality is, unless you become really lucky with something, the harder you work at your job, it might get you a promotion, it might get you a little bit of a better job at a different company, etc. And the way that it was told to me was, you might get to upgrade your Cadillac for a BMW, or something like that. But unless you get really lucky, the harder that you work, you're only going to get marginal gains across your life. So if you are doing it for the money, it's never going to feel enough. If you're doing it because you care about what you're doing and it actually gives you an intrinsic motivation, or a positive feeling, it's going to matter so much more. And I saw that in consulting, that I had this path to not even riches, but just path to a very solid income for the rest of my life. But I didn't like what I was doing, and so I knew that even though I would one day get to upgrade to that BMW or etc., that if I wasn't doing something that I was going to enjoy, then it was just going to be marginal increases for the rest of my life. And then choosing behavioral science, I actually really enjoy what I'm doing, which is wild to say about a career. So I think that it's really important to, money is obviously a big piece, but it is not the only piece. And really trying to find a path, a niche for an individual to find. If one can do that, it's a huge opportunity.
That is a phenomenal answer, Connor. I mean, I think you killed two birds with one stone with just that answer alone. So thanks for that. Uh, my follow up question is, Connor, if you were to invite three or four guests for a dream dinner, let's say four guests for a dream dinner, who would they be and why?
Wow. Oh man, there's so many people who I've probably said I would love to do this with that are not going to come to mind immediately. Um, Michael Lewis is definitely one of them. I really like Michael Lewis. He wrote The Undoing Project, which is about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. He also wrote Moneyball, and I love his writing. I think he is someone who I would just love to chat with and see how his mind works. Also wrote The Big Short, which a lot of people probably know the movie at this point. I mean, I've been really lucky that I've had a chance to meet a lot of the leaders in the behavioral science field. The one person I haven't that I'd love to chat with is Daniel Kahneman. So he would be another one that I would just really like to. He said some pretty profound things over the years, especially as he ages, thinking about like the most impactful biases. He's also walked back some of his early thinking, which I really admire that he's willing to accept that he was wrong in places. Um, so he would be another person. Um, I would also. I'm. It is there's so many names bouncing around in my head. I think the other one I guess I haven't met is Cass Sunstein, and I would love to just understand how he works because he is like he of all of the people in this field just produce an insane amount of content, and he's written so many books. I think he would just to understand how one creates that much content that still is really good and is still sane. And the last one, and this is more just because I finished watching his latest documentary recently, but I he is my favorite documentarian. Is his name's Adam Curtis, and he's done a couple of BBC documentaries. The most recent one being "You Can't Get You Out of My Head," and my favorite one is "The Century of the Self." Is was one. And in this latest one of "Can't Get You Out of My Head," he actually has a pretty strong critique of the behavioral science field, and I really enjoyed seeing somebody attack the field. Not attack in an academic sense, the field to call out some of its flaws. And I love his work, and I loved this critique, and it really left me thinking a lot about what how do we satisfy some of his concerns. So those would be Michael Lewis, Adam Curtis, kind of coming from the journalism media side, and then Kahneman and Sunstein coming from the academic side.
That is quite an awesome dinner table. So yeah, I would love to be a fly on that wall. Yeah.
Uh, the last question that I have for you, Connor, is that what is one thing that others don't agree with you on?
So that's a really tough one, Swami. I'm trying to think. At the biggest disagreement that I have, especially with other behavioral scientists, and I think this comes again from my consulting background, but also from just the years that I've been doing this, is that I truly do believe what I said about the ethics before of that creating content that is better than nothing is is my ethical guideline. And I have had people say that that is way too simple, that is not um that like how am I to judge that? It's a very good critique. I overall feel as though it is to a degree almost too businessy to approach it that way. But I also believe truly that businesses are going to go forth with decisions with or without research. And so getting something there that is better than just pure intuition is better than nothing. I ultimately can't find a way to justify anything else, especially when the train is moving and you know the train will continue to move. I've also had people say, well, then you should just, throw your hands up and say, well, then then you don't want research. And so I've gotten, like I said, a lot of critiques on that. But it's something that I hold pretty true. So I think that would be one of the biggest ones. And then I would also just say building the Applied Behavioral Science Association, I've had people suggest, why are you trying to add boundaries to a field that's still so new? Why are you trying to say you're a behavioral scientist, you're not a behavioral scientist, when we still don't really know what a behavioral scientist is? And again, I think it's a good critique, but my similar to that ethical guideline is, people are going to hire behavioral scientists because it is the nice, I'm trying to think of a good word to describe it, but popular new job title. So companies are going to do it with or without definition. And I think that providing something is better than just a hiring manager going, well, this is what I'm going to decide as a behavioral scientist, and then ultimately hiring someone who is not going to be able to do some of the core tenets. So yeah, so those would be kind of the two that fall similarly under the same line.
So my final question to you, Connor, is: given how we've had our conversation and given the experiences that you had speaking to us, who do you think would make a great guest on ContraMinds? Whom would you recommend join us and our listeners for an in-depth conversation?
I think another really good behavioral scientist who has a lot of, oh, he and I share a fair amount of similar ideas, but I think we also have enough unique experience that we have enough of a different story to tell. His name is Florent. I referenced him. He was former chief uh, manager of behavioral science at Allstate. Uh, he's got a French last name that I'm gonna butcher, but it's like Florent Boussian. um, and so he would be one individual, trying to kind of go through my repository of names and individuals. Um, yeah, I think Florence interesting just because he I believe he started. Another person is Jim Gusha, who started his career as an actuary, and then became really interested in behavioral science. Decided to dedicate his focus to that, and now he's the chief data scientist at Deloitte, and but still is doing mostly behavioral science work. And he was a great mentor of mine in my career. um, but I think he has a very very great take on the field. Very unique story in it. Yeah, those are two people that come to mind. I know I'm going to be upset, similar to the dinner table question later on. I'll be like, why didn't I think about this person? But those are two people who've been good mentors to me. And I think that they would be good. They both have very unique stories, and I know I love the ContraMinds philosophy of trying to find people that kind of took a different than standard path. So yeah.
So, Connor, I would like to thank you once again for taking the time and joining us on ContraMinds. It was a pleasure and privilege to have you with us for all this time, and thanks for sharing all your ideas and your lessons and your aspirations and your journey with us. And we deeply appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Connor. It was absolutely fascinating. Your beliefs, your value systems, your authenticity with which you expressed your views and uh, you know expressed your thoughts was amazing. Really enjoyed it, and thanks a lot.
Vignesh Swami, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed the question. You all can be hard interviewers. I'm joking, but no, it truly did. I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly, and yeah, it was a pleasure being on the show.